Hello, and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. I'm Nathan Wainstein, and with me today, as always, still stuck on Nathan Avenue since 2001, 2021, it's Brian Counter.
Hey Nathan, I'm excited to be talking about this game with you today.
Me too. I'm stoked. I have a lot of thoughts. I'm sure you do too. I'll just say, I just glitched up in there and mixed up 2001 and 2021, which is the latter is, of course, when we first met at ACLA. But 2001 is appropriate because that's when the original Silent Hill 2 came out. I'm pretty sure. So maybe you have been stuck on Nathan Avenue since 2001 and you just didn't know
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, it feels like it, I guess, after starting to play this remake.
it. So I gather from your texts from last night and this morning that the game is evoking a pretty visceral response. So I thought we could just start by having you say a little bit about what that response is like. Like what's this game making you feel?
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, famously, I think this game is pretty heavy in terms of content, of course. I mean, there's like a warning even before you start playing it, right? There's like a content warning or whatever, which feels super appropriate for this game. But I think what they don't warn you about is that especially playing with headphones. So I guess just to kind of anecdotally talk about it, I was ill-advisedly playing last night very late with headphones. Um, and I already knew this game was going to be one that sound is just like as I think as you said, Nathan, like sound is key in this game. Like it's a huge part of playing the game. Um, but playing through with late at night with headphones on and uh first of all there's like the kind of I guess non-diegetic music or whatever, like kind of ambient, or I guess you could call it like dark ambient cycling drones that are playing that feel like they're kind of always approaching and receding, and they change based on where you're going. But then of course, you start playing and you start kind of noticing that there's this kind of radio sound, but also it's like a sound I associate from playing the Fallout series with like radiation. Like if you're getting near to an irradiated place, there's this like crackling sound that will happen that kind of tells you that you're getting irradiated, which will be eventually lead to your death. That starts playing as soon as you are near any enemies, and oftentimes you can't see them, right? And especially when you're indoors with a bunch of locked doors, but also open doors, that can be pretty terrifying. But as far as my history, like I for some reason I thought I had played this game, like the original whatever back in the early 2000s, but I don't know that I have, unless this remake is totally different. I know I have, read quite a bit about it and also like watched a bunch of playthroughs. I'm aware of kind of the trajectory of the narrative of the story or of the game.
Hmm.
But yeah, playing it playing it now, it's immersive. I guess the first thing I'll say to toss it back over to you is that it's as we discussed in our episode with Shane, like we all kind of tend to play games as a multitasking exercise, like listening to things or listening to music or chatting with people or listening to a lecture or podcast or something. With this game, you just absolutely cannot do that. And it's not even just like, oh, optimally you would have the sound on. It's that you can't do it. I think this game like demands your full attention. Uh,
Yeah.
that leads me to a few other things that maybe we can bring up for a bit. But what about you? What's your history with this series?
Yeah, I mean, the idea, I mean, just first of all, like, I think we were both kind of proposing an anti-immersive way of playing Elden Ring when we were chatting with Shane in our last episode. And I think both of us often play games non-immersively, but Silent Hill is absolutely a game I feel like you have to play it immersively. And that's part of why the sound features so heavily in the game. Like, it's this really distinctive kind of, yeah, sort of industrial yeah, drone or just like noise. Like I think I want to say in the apartment building in Woodside Apartments, maybe it's Blue Creek Apartments, one of the sort of tenements that you're traversing. There's just kind of this like industrial clanking, like this heavy, almost like horrible, oppressive, like clanking noise. And it's a lot of stuff like that, like just kind of like pure soundscape, like harsh, dissonant, just like uncomfortable noise. And one thing that I think is striking, just as a kind of initial thought about the overall aesthetic of the game, is this combination of a sort of industrial soundscape and atmosphere with the bucolic setting of Silent Hill. That Silent Hill is supposed to be, I think it's in New England, a kind of quaint village on a lake, a tourist town in a way, vacation town in New England. Now there is, in the way that a lot of East Coast, Eastern Seaboard vacation towns often have. There is a sort of like there's a kind of industrial outskirts to the town, and it's a lot of ruined, sort of old brick, like early 20th century buildings that have fallen into total disrepair. You know, auto shops, houses, and that's a really cool aspect of the series too that we can talk about more. But yeah, I mean, just to start like that contrast or that combination of this like heavy, almost like urban industrial soundscape and the sort of pastoral the small town vibe of Silent Hill is really productive and interesting. Um, as far as my history with the series goes, I've never played a Silent Hill game before this. We're talking about the 2024, or I guess 2023, Bloober Team remake of Silent Hill 2 from 2001. That is a game that I was really intrigued by when I was playing, when I was a teenager or when I was younger back in the PS2 era, but I never played it, and I think it's just because I was too scared to play it. Like I played almost all the other great, the famous games from that era. I played it. PS2 was I mean, that was my system. So I ranged around a lot, but I never played Silent Hill. And so I went into this completely cold. I'll say now, like I have finished the remake, and I went on Xbox the Xbox store and I bought the HD remaster of the original. So I played a couple hours of that too, and I can talk a bit about some things I've noticed playing the two games together. They're actually strikingly similar. I'm sort of amazed by how similar they still are. Um, but no, I went into this with no prior knowledge about the game other than the existence of Pyramid Head. Did you know about Pyramid Head?
Oh yeah, I've heard plenty about Pyramid Head. I know I'm still waiting. So just to be transparent, I'm not that far into the game, although it feels like I've been stranded in hell for, years now. Based on playing it for just several hours at this point. I haven't encountered Pyramid Head yet, but it's
No.
become kind of memeified or whatever, right? And even when I fire it up the game, there's the choice to have it's like so among the few things that you can choose, there's the usual kind of saturation or brightness of the game, but then you can choose whether you're playing it with updated graphics or like the what they call the 90s graphic, um, which are really just more washed out looking. Like it's the same graphics, it's just a different, I guess, filter or something on them. But the other thing you can do is play it either with James with a mask on or a mask off. And if you flip it to mask on, it's him with the pyramid head, but it's a pizza box. Which kind of I appreciate the humor they're injecting to like allow us to all still be sane and go back to our normal lives, I guess. But
For
but
sure.
yeah.
It's funny that I mean it's a remake project, so maybe it's part of just the kind of bells and whistles and extras of this remake. And I do think this is maybe we're hoping I mean we may talk more about this game in a future episode. And I think thinking more about this game as a remake is pretty interesting because it does fascinating things with the original material, including some kind of like diegetic connections to the original game, almost like the Final Fantasy remake trilogy. At least that's what I'm picking up as I play it without much Silent Hill lore in my back pocket. Um, but just to circle back quickly, like uh, um, for context, for those because this is a bit of a departure from the other games we've discussed on this podcast. Silent Hill is a survival horror series. it's like Resident Evil, but with lots of ideas, you know? I was just describing to a friend Resident Evil, especially 4, is a game with like not a single thought, which is a kind of mark of distinction and beauty about that game, but Silent Hill has got so much going on. Um, so I think inspired by like David Lynch and other yeah, I think Lynch seems to be a large inspiration for both for the whole whole series, where they're all set at this. As far as I know, I've only played two and watched some of playthrough of one. Set at this village in New England, I think, again, provisionally New England, a town that's blanketed in this heavy fog, so you can barely see, you know, more than 20, 30 feet in front of you. And it kind of manifests like the subconscious or unconscious of the different characters. And so each each person who ventures there descends into this kind of nightmare world where aspects of their psyche are made material and they sort of battle with their own demons, essentially. Um, One more thing, just to touch on your opening remarks, Brian. You mentioned the sound. Uh, and one
Yeah.
thing that struck me right away is I remember again, yet again, I'm going to do this thing where I like mention something that I read and I'm forgetting where I read it. And this is one where I'm not even sure where I could how I would track it down. But um, I, my my sense is that the Silent Hill 2 radio mechanic is has often been discussed, or I've seen it discussed, I think, multiple places as just an interesting example of diegetic versus non-diegetic sound, or rather, more broadly, just as an interesting instance of sound design for a game. So we have the James, the protagonist in Silent Hill 2, shortly into the game, picks up this radio, and the radio emits static whenever you're near an enemy. So you can kind of use it to gauge your danger level. You can also use it to gauge whether the enemy that you've just shot or knocked over with a pipe is actually dead because the enemies will revive or they'll start twitching on the ground after they're seemingly dead. And so you want to make sure that, like in Resident Evil, that they're actually dead. And the static will stop when the static stops, they're definitively gone, and you can sort of proceed without any fear of them reanimating. Um, so it's a case of like, is James, it seems like James is the one hearing the static, you know, but maybe there's also it's unclear, right? Like maybe the static is just an interface for the player too. So it's interestingly both. I mean, I would again without having thought too deeply about this, and I'm sort of just paraphrasing things that I've seen, you know, I've heard people say, but like um the radio is an interesting case of like diegetic and non-diegetic sort of grounding for this kind of basic game mechanic. And one thing to, I just wanted to add to that, in playing through the original game on Xbox just over the last week, is I was struck by this other decision that's in the original Xbox version or the original PS2 version. I don't think it's in Silent Hill 2, although you just got to the Woodside Apartments, right? So maybe you can refresh my memory. But in the original game, when you arrive at the apartment complex, which is basically the first level of the game, like this sort of traversable space where you're going to be backtracking recursively through it, like a Resident Evil, like the police station in Resident Evil 2, for instance. Um, you when you try to open your map in this dark apartment building, you can't actually read the map, and the interface will say something like the map is too dark. It's too dark to read the map. You know, which was truly panic-inducing for me when I was playing the original game, even though I already knew somewhat what to expect having played the remake first. Um, and that's just like I'd never seen that in a game before. Like I'd never seen sort of preventing the use of a essential interface because of diegetic reasons. You know, Brian, do you remember like have you tried opening your map in the Woodside Apartments in the dark sort of hallways of that structure yet? Does the game let you look at your map?
So actually, no, I haven't tried using the map yet because I when maybe this is a weird like directional thing that I have just as a person, which is that streets I'm not so good on, but inside of a house, once I'm inside, I can tend to remember where things are. So I, walking around the streets, once we have the maps, it's a lot easier. And I or sorry, the streets are a lot harder, and you kind of need the map more. But walking in the apartments, I found myself kind of like I figured, that for example, when there's like some kind of event in the game, there's going to be a new place unlocked just by accident, and this maybe goes back to some of the some of the Elden Ring discussions we've had about something happens across the world of Elden Ring and therefore it opens up a gate somewhere else, you know? And I think maybe being like the idea of gatedness or what's gated in this game is something we should talk about a little later. But no, I haven't actually tried doing that. I guess next time I play, when I have the courage, I will try to look at the map. I just want to make one comment or one kind of connecting idea before I toss it back to you, which is that the Lynch connection I really like. Because of course this has to be, you know, influenced by Lynch, right? I mean, it's a deeply psychological game, and I guess my closest uh you know, comparison for a game like this that's terrifying is when I was really young and when I was playing, like as you mentioned already, the Resident Evil games, you know. But that's just zombies, right? Like that's mainly, at least the first few, which I did play on, you know, PlayStation 2 or whatever when I was really young. Uh, and there is something terrifying about being, you know, trapped in a house. You don't know what's behind the door. Everything is clunky and slow, and there's something just about the gameplay and the you know, what you could call combat that is very inhibitive or something like that, or prohibitive or whatever, that makes doing any kind of self-defense very difficult. Uh,
Hmm.
so that's my main kind of comparison. But as you mentioned, you know, this is like, you know, maybe maybe Resident Evil plus ideas or plus the influence of Lynch. And this is just like, this is anecdotal, I guess. But I think it's a nice connection, you know, because it's like psychological horror, right? Uh, rather than just survival horror, right? Like we know immediately that this is about this guy, this character's memories.
Hmm.
And I think we can definitely talk talk a lot about how this guy actually, like, controlling the character versus what happens in the cutscenes, how what kind of disjunction we get, because I think there are a lot of them. But there's a musician I really love. I like his music a lot, but he's has a YouTube channel and he made a video recently when David Lynch passed away. His name is Charlie Looker. He's a guitarist and singer. But
Sounds
when
like that sounds like a David Lynch character.
it does, yeah, it does. But when in this video on Lynch, he said something, he made this distinction about like Lynch, what Lynch does in his films versus what psychoanalysis or a certain version of psychoanalysis does, which is that with Lynch, it's like if dreams mean something, but there's no, I'm just paraphrasing because I haven't watched it in a while. I think I just watched it when it came out, but if dreams mean something, or if or whatever, or if psychological, you know, your psyche means something, but it can't be traced. There's no map for it. So it's like if and I guess this will play out through the whole experience of playing the game and getting through the entire narrative, but you know, having this character who is having these memories reactivated and always feeling, I won't say wonder, because I know that's something that we're both kind of interested in, right? Wonder, this kind of surprise, this kind of odd effect of seeing something that we, you know, that amazes us, right? So it's not wonder, it's almost like a dark wonder, right? Like always having a kind of dark wonder at what happens without being able to map it on necessarily, and, you know, onto categories or, you know, types of psychological or psychoanalytic categories, or, you know, personality types or whatever. And I feel like that's partly what, for me at least, and it's been a while since I've like really thought more critically about it, but that's kind of what I think Lynch partly does. Like I know you can read Lynch psychoanalytically, you kind of have to, but in the films themselves, it's like if you can't trace out what is happening. Like you know something is happening. It does have some kind of meaning, but at least for the characters, like I guess we could say diegetically or non-interpretively, there's something happening that has no origin, that has no answer, that just has to be as it is. And that is I think is part of what makes this game so compelling, so good, but also like maybe so terrifying, you know?
Yeah, I just love the idea of Dark Wonder. We'll definitely have to circle back to that. I wanted to touch on a couple things you just said. One of them you mentioned in passing the way in which there's a kind of discrepancy between James and the cutscenes and James and the gameplay. And it just struck me now that maybe there is, but if so, it's quite different from how that discrepancy usually works, especially dating back to like the PS2 era where cutscenes were able to render much more complex animations, right, and events, and could be much more cinematic than regular gameplay. So for a long time, it was standard to have characters doing like all these like crazy acrobatic, like cool things in cutscenes, right? And then when you're controlling the character, you're just kind of like plodding along like an automaton and like kind of doing these jerky animations. Like the attacking animation in the original Silent Hill 2 is quite stiff. Um, but here it's actually the opposite. Like James is totally sort of confused and like seems almost like he's got a concussion or something, and he's like sort of in a stupor. He's wandering around. He's kind of like disassociated, um, and seems just kind of like a normal guy in the cutscenes. But then in when the gameplay, you're like a total badass. Like you're like juking Pyramid Head like at the last minute, like you're playing Dark Souls, and then just beating him to death with a 2x4. And so it's like James is the action hero actually when you're playing and is the normal guy when you're watching the sort of plot only sections of the story. The other thing I wanted to mention was just the fact that you know, in your connection to Lynch and Dark Wonder, like you suggested that like in some ways it resists clean psycho, even though the content is clearly psychoanalytic or involving aspects of the psyche. It resists clean analysis or sort of the coherence effect of analysis. And from what I understand of Silent Hill 2, and certainly from my own playthrough of Silent Hill 2, where I was left completely confused at the end, um, I gather that there's not like one canon reading of what happened in Silent, and what actually happened to James and what happened in Silent Hill 2. This is a game that really does like propose these disjunctions or dissonances, and rather than gradually resolving them, just intensifies them and kind of weaponizes them in a way that like I think really great works of art often do. So that's something I really admire about this game is the way in which, if true, you know, maybe there's a Reddit thread out there or many threads that will prove me wrong, but if it's true that the game never resolves its contradictions, I think that's a really yeah, that's a distinctive and impressive aspect of it. And again, maybe connects to that idea of dark wonder.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, I can't because I have as I've mentioned, like I have I generally get the lore, you know, and I think maybe this is something that we can save for a future episode to kind of weigh in more on, especially if we are going to do a second episode, I think as we might be doing on this game. But one thing I maybe that we've already kind of mentioned that maybe I want to ask you about because you know you've written about this a lot and we've we've already kind of talked about in this podcast is the question of identification.
Mhm.
So, you know, like usually when you think about identification with a or the way that it's kind of like vulgarly written about in, you know, games criticism and not even just games, right? Like in there's this imaginary idea that the first person or even this, you know, second person or any person, right? Third person too, behind the shoulder does this as well in a game. We think that most media, whether it's literature or even music or games, especially, is encouraging us or even forcing us to identify with whether it's the character, the speaker, whatever. And you know, I certainly I don't feel identified with this guy James, but I do feel more than anything else I've played in recent memory. like very invested. Like there's like maybe a question of investment versus identification.
Or
Um,
identification with the body as opposed to the mind.
Sure. Yeah, and I think I think maybe you're more equipped to speak on this more eloquently than I am, but I think like that, especially, with the linking up with some of the sound design things that we've already talked about, that question becomes totally foregrounded for me when I'm playing this game. Like, no, I don't think I'm James, or I don't think I'm playing as James, but I do think that I get terrified when James is about to be, you know, ambushed by something I thought was dead that just got back up, or when the music is playing a certain sound, or when we have this kind of diegetic or maybe non-diegetic radio tone or crackle that's playing that seems to alert me that something's going on. And sometimes, sometimes it's just like a giant roach or whatever those things are, those like little things you can just kill with one hit. But sometimes it's a thing that you thought you killed 10 minutes ago, and it maybe just woke back up somehow, or it came out from under a car, or something worse, I guess. And I know that worse things are waiting for me in this game, so I'm kind of in an odd position, like talking about it, because I know that it's only going to get more terrifying, and this question will get a bit deeper for me.
You're totally right. There's so much interesting stuff going on with the question of identification here. Even going to the save points, right? The way in which, in Silent Hill, you save at these mysterious glowing red squares. It's just a totally inexplicable diegetic object. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be a piece of paper or like a portal or what? I don't know. But when you save, you get a shot of James's face. And he's sort of staring dead-eyed into this kind of mirror, or is he staring at you, the player? And in a sense, like as you save the game, I would say that that interface reminds you precisely that you're not James, that you're looking at James, and James is sort of looking at you or kind of blankly staring back at you. Um, and that blank stare is emblematic, like it's James is a character who it's impossible to identify with mentally because we just don't know what he's thinking at any time. And I mean, Brian, you alluded to this. This is sort of an argument I make in the Bloodborne book, and I actually have a piece coming out. It'll be out by the time this podcast goes up, actually, on The Last of Us Part Two, and the question of empathy and identification. It's often said that games are these tremendous vehicles for identification and empathy because we don't, and, this is what they say, we don't just sort of watch the characters or read about them like in other media, we are the characters. But of course, that's not actually true. I mean, we are, in a way, controlling aspects of the characters, mainly their limbs. Like we control how they move, and control whether they attack or not. But that in a way just heightens this fundamental disjunction that's present, for instance, in film, right? Where we can watch the characters but don't actually have very good, very clear avenues for understanding what they're thinking or feeling at a given moment. Games are just like that. Like we don't know what characters are thinking very often, and yet we're also controlling their body. So there's just a weird sort of tension or contradiction in that level of control over one aspect of selfhood, but total obscurity or opacity when it comes to actual psychological identification. Um, and some games, that's a problem, and the games don't resolve it. Some games will have like I don't know, Horizon Zero Dawn or something, which is a game I like, but the characters will talk to themselves, because we don't have access to their thoughts, so there has to be some way of communicating to us, the player, like what the characters are thinking or feeling, and so we have this kind of lame monologuing that feels totally artificial. It feels like kind of like a version of soliloquy or something. Um, but this is a game, right, that actually wants to enhance that sense of disjunction. Like it wants us to feel like we don't know who James is and we don't know what James felt and what James knows. And again, the way like this is a game that weaponizes dissonance. It leans into the dissonances of game playing in a really productive and powerful way. The last thing on identification is just that, again, like to sort of, because it's so fresh in my mind because I've been playing it. In the original Silent Hill 2, it's so crazy. When you go to your pause screen, um, it took me forever to figure out how this works, but your health bar There's no health bar on the screen. There's a health interface in your menu, and the health interface. This is on PS2, so it even seems like kind of wild that this is happening at like such an early generation. What you get is a snapshot of where you've paused the game. So it's a picture within a picture. Like in the menu, you have your equipment, whatever, your items, whatever, settings and stuff. And then in the kind of left-hand middle of the screen, there's a square, and that has a picture of James, exactly where you are in the game, but at one additional remove. And the picture will grow increasingly staticky and red as you're getting closer and closer to death. And so it's like static again is both the sign of diegetic justification or motivation. Like again, like the static in the radio tells us that enemies are near us, and ostensibly James can also hear the static, right? But in this case, the static is also the sign of like non-identification or exteriority. Like the static in the image of James tells us precisely that we're watching a video of James. We aren't playing as you sorry, we aren't James, right? James himself would not be seeing static in the image depicting himself wherever he is. It's super reflexive, it's super meta, and again, it's like the same effects, the same static idea that's marshaled for like completely different antithetical ends. That does strike me now as I say this as another instance of like at least the original game just totally leaning into this sort of very productive dissonance that's innate to game playing.
Yeah, I mean, I love all of that, and I especially because I'm mainly playing it. I've switched back and forth a few times, but on the remake, I've been playing it with the what they call the 90s graphics or whatever, right? So that seems to just make everything look a little bit more staticky. Like I've tried to switch back and forth a handful of times, and the colors are just a little bit denser when you get into the contemporary, I guess. But there's another kind of dissonance, and we've been talking about like diegetic versus non-diegetic, and I just want to bring up a moment because we, I guess, so far have been speaking more in general about the game in the remake. So there's a moment where you go into, and I'll apologize because I forget exactly sorry, which of the many businesses that you uh find this in. There's like a jukebox, right? And there's this whole kind of you find all these notes scattered everywhere. You find a half of a record, and then you go to the jukebox and the other half is there, and you have this vinyl glue. You can glue the record back together, and then if you found the two key for like the two on the jukebox, because you have to type in what you want to play, you can play the record. And there's this moment, I guess another thing we should say is that there are all these different moments where James, again, like, I guess diegetically, like when we are playing, you trigger a moment for James, right? This is partly why that it's psychological or psychoanalytic. But when this when this memory plays, like he seems to remember something, but he remembers a place that he was with. What's her name? His Mary, is that the name?
Very, yeah.
Yeah. So he puts this record in the jukebox, which again looks like an old, old school jukebox. You might still find one today, but what's going to be in there is going to be mostly pop hits, or even if you're being a little bit more strict about, the time frame, it might be, I don't know, doo-wop or kind of oldies or soul songs or whatever. But what plays is this kind of very cinematic piano
Mm.
piece, which to me just strikes me as very odd. And I guess I would have to go and look at what happens in the original if this is the same. But it's like it's a very compelling, beautiful piano piece. But there's I would say that there's absolutely no way that would be in the jukebox, right? Unless you're in 2025, like going to a certain kind of bar that would have maybe one or two very cinematic, maybe like modern classical pieces or something in the jukebox. So there's a
Yeah.
weird moment where what plays on screen, and this is also it is diegetically what he's hearing because he the record, breaks apart at the end, right? Like it starts skipping and then it breaks apart. It's all in these pieces after you've gone through this whole process to glue it back together. It reminds me of, something like Max Richter or, things that you would see scoring some contemporary films.
Yeah,
And
for sure. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
no, I'm just saying, like it's an odd moment in the game where if that is truly what he's listening to, it just feels anachronistic. It feels, and maybe it doubles down, I guess, well, content wise for sure, but also formally on what we're getting in the game. Like he is that feels to me like a question of form, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, the idea of like I love imagining the counterfactual where like you could take the same puzzle, right? And have everything the same but just change the track that plays, or change the song that plays, and there's a lot of funny options. Like what if it was like pep sounds? What if it was like My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy? What if it was Disintegration? That would be rad. The Cure if Disintegration started playing.
Yeah.
Actually, I feel like that's weirdly fitting. Maybe we can talk about that. But the one artist that to go back to David Lynch is like, is it Angelo Badalamenti,
Yeah.
the composer for Twin Peaks or the Twin Peaks theme song? Like that it seems like he could have an album of just like cinematic piano, like emotion, sort of like sentimental, music that could conceivably be found in a jukebox. At least if you're inside a David Lynch movie. Um, a
Right.
couple other thoughts I had here. I mean, well, actually, I mean, going back to the Cure, to Disintegration, it did make me think of, your piece Adventi on Plainsong, and Wind and Atmosphere.
Mhm.
And I did want to ask about atmosphere here. In fact, this is going to be maybe this already is, but it's going to be even more of a sort of narcissistic episode for me. In that not only, as we've alluded to, is there a Nathan Avenue in Silent Hill 2. In fact, Nathan Avenue is one of the streets that's also in the original, and it's the last street that you traverse. I'm pretty sure because that's where you eventually go to the end of Nathan Avenue and enter this building. I won't spoil it, and then you go to somewhere totally different.
You're the
Uh,
final boss, man. Yeah.
yeah. So not only is there Nathan Avenue, but I also thought this could be our first, maybe where we debut our segment, our, potentially recurring segment, Wainstein and Smog, which is our a segment about atmosphere. Of course, it should be really named after you because you're the one who writes about atmosphere and the aesthetics of atmosphere in art and literature. But the Dark Souls pun was too good to ignore.
Yeah.
So yeah, what did you think about that opening? Again, just that opening hour of the game where you're just like wandering around the streets of Silent Hill, like, in this pressing fog and with wind and these weird noises and just kind of like it's weirdly peaceful, even though there are roaches and occasional enemies. And that I would say, just add a bit of context, that section of sort of free roaming exploration is it's in the original game, but it's pretty expanded here. Like you can go into a lot more of the buildings, and I'm pretty sure like the record puzzle, for instance, is not in the original. I don't remember it in my recent playthrough. So what did you think of that initial Silent Hill proper town exploration sequence and the atmosphere of it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I know it's kind of a cliche to say that the atmosphere is amazing or the game has a lot of atmosphere, but I mean, it is maybe to come back to the question of identification, it does make you feel, especially if you're listening closely, right, which is we've established is one of the uh key things about this game is the sound. If you're listening really closely and I do think it feels more about the sound in a way, like that there are these kind of, of course, as playing this game in the early hours, you keep turning around to see if anyone's following you because you keep hearing these, especially with headphones on, you hear these sounds of what sounds like footsteps or these wet noises, like before you get to the actual town, there are these, you have to walk through this kind of after the graveyard, you walk kind of through this path to the town. Um, and at every step there's something else happening, right? So there's no, it's not just I do think it's like a real achievement in terms of atmosphere because it's it is maybe to go, this is another thing we've been kind of positing as a question for us together is, it's non-narrative, right? It's not really about narrative. There are these moments where you hear a sound that is accidental, which feels more, or maybe I'll say it's non-plot related, right? There are these moments that feel very realistic in terms of hearing just like a, especially like around the water. The water sounds incredible. There are these kind of like watery sounds. You walk through the forest kind of on this path where you keep hearing these I don't know, noises that seem menacing. So I guess what I'll say, I have a hard time speaking about it in terms of what I've already kind of been thinking about because this feels obviously doomed or dark, you know. I think it's very aesthetically in terms of what I'm thinking about with the atmosphere. It does create this kind of very foreboding and dark atmosphere, and it's
Mm.
through, I think it's like it is through, and I won't, I don't know about other games that really do this. This is the first time maybe that I've kind of experienced this, which is that it does it through kind of, I guess maybe other than smell, it does this through all the senses, right? Like, I don't know, maybe it's just the part that I just recently got to, but the controller is vibrating constantly. Like there's a low rumble to the control. And I'll say too that I'm playing on PS5, so the controller is like always like very gently vibrating. There's sound coming depending on whether you're playing with headphones or like on the TV with the sound up. There's sound coming from a couple different places. With headphones, it's coming from a few directions. I'm seeing this fog, which does look like static. You mentioned this, about the static with the save points, but there are moments where the fog totally intensifies in a way that makes it look like static. Uh,
And fog and static are pretty semantically related. It's actually that's a really interesting point, Brian. I hadn't realized that or thought about that. But yes, like we talk about like, static as disrupting communications and fog disrupting like the fog of war, right?
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Even like your signal's really foggy,
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Same with noise, right? We mentioned noise, but noise is the same thing, right? Noise is just stuff that overwhelms our ability to interpret. So,
Yeah, and that I mean that just that image, I know what you're talking about because the fog, the visual effect of the fog, at least on base PS5, I'm playing it now on my PS5 Pro. We switched cities recently, and so I played my playthrough on a base PS5, and now I'm playing on PS5 Pro, and I do think the game looks a little different, but I want to say on base PS5 there was a kind of graininess to the fog where
yeah,
I totally see what you mean. And that's again, like, it's just so definitive of the sort of particular aesthetic of this game, like this combination of something sort of mechanical, industrial, right? Or just, like maybe not industrial so much as like post-industrial, a static, and then fog as the kind of emblem of this pastoral, like natural beauty of Silent Hill. That the fog is coming off this lake, right? And it's a sort of lakeside resort town. That it's like precisely that those two things seem antithetical, and yet in this they're also the same thing in this game. We talked. I proposed sort of jokingly when we were talking with Shane last episode something like the toxic pastoral, right? To describe that swamp, the John Hines National Wildlife Refuge. Shout out to Philly. But here, maybe it's something like the industrial pastoral. That maybe that's the mode of Silent Hill, and again, that's a very for me, it's like something pretty. It's pretty unique. I don't know if I've seen that in many other places.
yeah, and I think maybe to wrap things up or move in that direction, it really does kind of tie together in a way that we, I think, haven't discussed too much before, the diegetic and non-diegetic, layers of the game. So
Hmm.
the atmosphere. course, it's the atmosphere of this place, Silent Hill, but it's also what I see on the screen. It's also, I have to move my chair around if I'm playing during the day because there's too much sunlight coming in from outside. So everything there's either too much white or too much black, right? There's too much fog or too much darkness inside of these apartments. Uh, and that's, that does feel to line up a little bit with what's going on with this character I'm controlling.
Yeah. One more thought on the fog too before we go. Brian, and you'll have to tell me what you think about this because this could be totally particular to me. One thing that comes up again and again with Silent Hill, the series, and particularly I saw it in so much of the coverage of the remake, in particular the reviews that I read after finishing it. It's often brought up that the fog in Silent Hill, which is the defining feature again of the setting, atmospheric, right? And again, in both senses, as literal atmosphere and also providing the sort of aesthetic atmosphere, was born of a technical limitation. So many games in the PS1, which is where the original Silent Hill game debuted, the PS1 N64 era, had this pervasive fog because games couldn't render large distances, particularly wide open natural distances. Um, and so the game, again, instrumentalized or cannily used this technical limitation for aesthetic effect. And then for the PS5 version, like games are very good now or quite capable of rendering. You could definitely see the entire open world section of Silent Hill, right? Or see far across the lake if you wanted to render that on PS5. But the developers actually intentionally put in this fog as as a foregrounded device or decision, precisely to create that atmosphere, right, and also to maintain continuity or similarity with the original game that it's based on. And I bring up all of this just to say that for some reason, whenever I read that or see people mention that, I find it sort of grating. Like, I don't find that to be a particularly compelling aspect of this game. And maybe it's just by dint of repetition. Maybe this is just like sour grapes, but it always feels a little bit pedantic to me. It's like, yeah, like we know that games have technical limits. There's a long history. There's so many different examples of games having technical limitations and that leading to certain aesthetic decisions, right? That then become sort of solidified over the course of games history and become devices or conventions in of themselves. So I'm not sure what it is about this. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's like why do are we so fixated on this one example when there's so much else we could talk? So many other. I would imagine there are other. They're not coming to mind right now, but I think if we had a few minutes, we could think of some other examples of similar phenomena that to the fog in Silent Hill. But I don't know. Does that ha evoke any reaction in you when if I say like if I point out, oh, this fog, it's so constitutive of the mood of this game, right? It's so important to the vibe and to the meaning of Silent Hill as a series, and yet it's really there partly because the PS1 hardware was not up to rendering the sort of totality of the space.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know what you're saying because it's very easy to just kind of remark that um, a remake leans into the limitations of the original or whatever, right? Like I think that's kind of partly what you're saying. So this fog, well, so what that means is that this fog began as accidental, but so does all fog, right? I mean, this is what bridges maybe the atmosphere of something uh a piece of art, right? The atmosphere that we think about with a piece of art, whatever the genre or medium is, and what we mean by atmosphere when we're encountering that art, phenomenologically or as a reader, as a player, as a listener, whatever, right? Um, it's funny, it makes me think this is kind of a little bit of a sidetracked thing, but and I think we will talk about this a little bit later in a different episode. But I recently was at a concert where there was a few metal bands played. They're all kind of classic bands, but one of them, the first band that played, is a UK, kind of death metal band, I guess, called Carcass, and I believe they started kind of in the early '80s, and they had a couple really classic albums. Like their first couple albums actually kind of are credited with giving birth to a new genre called grindcore. So any metalheads out there will know what grindcore is, but it's really like just really dirty production, really fast songs, like really messy sounding, just pretty brutal. Uh, but when they, this band, like, I think famously doesn't really own that. Like, they don't really, that's not kind of something that they were trying to do. It's not, they don't really care about that label. I think when they've spoken about it, they kind of just say, like, look, we had bad equipment, like we were trying to record an album and yeah, it just sounded like a mess, and since then they've kind of evolved into different uh better production, quote unquote, right? Just like you might say something on PS5 versus PS2 has better quality. But I think this is part of our question in general as like gamers as well. Like, we still look back to those old games and see we see how they uh work still, no matter what time we're in. Like there's still they mark something like historically, but also still, I think for us, like experientially as pieces of art that we're not going into them thinking, oh, well, what was the recording quality? How many people were on the production team of this game? What kind of processors were they using or whatever, right? Like we see them as a finished piece, and then we go into them and uh experience them as they are, as they're cut off from the process of creating them, right?
For
Uh,
sure.
and so I think there's a nice resonance between the literal and the metaphorical, whether we're talking about quality, whether we're talking about atmosphere, fog, whatever, right? So even if fog was an accident, uh, when it becomes literalized or diegetic, uh, when we reflect back to what we mean by atmosphere or fog in in the remake, it means something a little bit different from how, from what it meant when we're solely thinking about the limitations, I think
Yeah.
that's probably what I would say for now.
Yeah, and another nice resonance is simply between the word grindcore and Silent Hill 2, which is this is a grindcore-ass game, I would say, not knowing anything about the musical tradition, just like this is a grimy game, man. And you even said earlier, like it marshals or it produces its aesthetic atmospheric effect through every sense, maybe but smell and maybe taste. Um, I want to go out on a limb and say right now on the record that Silent Hill 2 is nevertheless probably the smelliest game of all time. Like just it looking at the textures, it's just so wet. Like it's just a moist, moldy, dank game. And you can really viscerally smell the environments once you're inside the apartment building, especially. Um,
Yeah.
that in a way that I don't think I've ever experienced in a video game ever in my life. The Woodside apartments, sorry, the Blue Creek apartments in particular, not after Woodside, you'll go to the Blue Creek Apartments, which is like the mirror image of the Woodside Apartments, but just covered in mold and slime, and it's just rank. Like it's disgusting, in a sublime way. So I look forward to you getting there.
Yeah, I would say just one correction, which is that it's grind core,
Oh.
not grindcore. But I think your mishearing is actually pretty appropriate here. Because I do hear a lot of grinding noises when I'm there, right? But yeah, just to speak on that for a second, I was surprised there weren't more maggots or flies around or whatever, right? Like while I'm playing. Um, but there's also a note, maybe this is the last thing we will maybe touch on. There's a note near this kind of barricade, right? So this is we'll have to pick up on this next time, right? Because James as a character is impressively respectful of barricades and even, traffic cones and, things that they could easily jump over, right? So there is I think we'll talk about this, I'm sure, next time around, like what is gated versus what isn't and how it's gated. But there's a note like near a near this big kind of like barricade that looks like it kind of goes under a highway underpass or something, right? There's this big veil sort of, and there's a little note there that says like I can't smell anything but they smell or
Huh.
something. Uh, I'll find it for next time, but I don't know what it's referring to. I don't know if it's referring to these kind of creatures that are always in these weird BDSM suits following you around and trying to, spew bile on you and stuff, or if it's something else. But there's a note that specifically talks about that feeling. Because of course I can't smell the game, like uh but it does seem like an incredibly like stinky, smelly place to be in a bad way.
That's that's incredible. Let's just end there on that brilliant point, Brian. So yeah, let's wrap up and we'll hopefully continue our discussion of Silent Hill 2. But in the meantime, hey, look, especially in Silent Hill, it's dark out there, it's foggy. You got to keep that magic lantern lit.
You as well. I appreciate it. You too.
Take care.